Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever to come out of Michigan. Please tell us where you're watching from right now, because this story will go through decades of secrets and silences that are heavier than winter snow. This video is not real. It was made up for fun. Any resemblance to real people, dead or alive, is completely coincidental. Detroit, Michigan, a city that smelled like factories and promised progress after the war. But in the outskirts, far from the lights of the city, there were places where time seemed to move more slowly. Families had farmed the same land for generations and kept their own codes of honor. Holloway Farm was a few kilometers from the main road, in a stretch of fields that went on forever. This property was handed down from father to son, and with it came the weight of the land and the decisions made over the years. Thomas Holloway had run that farm with a firm hand ever since he got it from his father during the Great Depression. People in the area knew him as a man of few words, someone who would rather be quiet than talk. His wife, Margaret, helped him with the hard work of keeping the property running. They grew corn, raised cows, and sold milk to local stores. It was a simple life. Or, at least, that's what everyone thought. In that part of Michigan, the closest neighbors lived miles away, and visits were rare. Each family took care of its own affairs, and nobody asked too many questions. But in 1948, things started to change. Small things that didn't seem like much on their own started to come together to make a scary pattern. People who lived near the main road at night said they saw strange lights coming from the Holloway farm. Not the usual lights of a house or barn, but flashes that came and went, as if someone were working on something that couldn't wait for dawn. Some people said they heard muffled sounds, echoes carried by the wind across the empty fields, but no one looked into it. No one was knocking on the Holloway's door to find out what was going on. It was an unspoken rule there that everyone had to look out for themselves. That year's winter was especially bad. The snow covered everything, making the landscape look like a quiet, white desert. The roads were impassable for weeks, which made the farms in the area even more cut off. People in town started to see Thomas Holloway less often during this time. When he did show up to buy supplies, he looked different. He was thinner and had dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. Margaret had changed too. At first, she was shy but polite. Now, she avoids any kind of conversation and lowers her eyes when someone tries to say hello. The couple looked like they were carrying an invisible weight, something that was eating away at them from the inside. Rumors started to spread slowly, as they always do in small towns. Someone said they saw something strange moving behind the property, near the old barn that no one used anymore. Another person said they heard muffled screams on a night when there was no wind. But they were only whispers, tales told in low voices in the bars of the town, and rumors that didn't become real until spring came and the snow melted, revealing things that should have stayed hidden forever. A worker who was hired to help plant the new crop saw a part of the farm where Thomas told them not to work. There was a strip of land at the back of the property, close to the edge of the forest, that was not touched. Thomas told the young man that the soil wasn't good for planting, and that it was better to leave it as it was when he asked why. The explanation made sense at first, but the way he spoke and looked away gave me a strange feeling. Margaret started going to church in her area more often. She always sat alone in the last pew, and she stayed there even after everyone else had left. The pastor tried to talk to her a few times and offer her spiritual help, but she just shook her head and walked away without saying anything. That woman was in a lot of pain, more than what most people in the country go through. It was like she had a secret that was slowly eating her up every day. The night lights kept showing up, but only at night and from the same place. Some people thought Thomas was working on something, like adding to the barn or digging a new well. But no one saw any signs of progress during the day. The farm stayed the same with its old buildings and huge fields. It was all happening in the dark, away from curious eyes. The longer it went on, the louder that silence got, as if the land itself were keeping a terrible secret that should never come to light. Spring not only thawed the fields, but it also made people who knew the Holloways feel more and more uneasy. There were wildflowers blooming all over the pastures, but there was one strip of land that stayed strangely empty, as if something was stopping life from growing there. That was the exact area that Thomas kept to himself, surrounded by an old wooden fence that he had strengthened himself during the winter. Sundays in the area were marked by the tradition of getting together after church to share news and strengthen ties in the community. Margaret used to be a part of these times, always there but not too loud. She would now leave as soon as the last hymn was sung, hurrying to the pickup truck where Thomas was waiting with the engine running. They would drive away, kicking up dust and leaving people looking and whispering. Helen, who owns the grocery store in town, saw small changes in how the couple shopped. Before, Margaret would come once a week, pick out things carefully and talk about recipes and the weather. Now, it was Thomas who came by, always in a hurry, to buy only what he needed. He also started buying a lot of lime, saying he needed it to improve the soil. Helen didn't question it, even though the amount seemed too high for a farm that size. She told herself that each of them knew what they needed for their land. Those strange flashes of light kept coming at night. A neighbor who came back late from a trip to Detroit said he saw not only lights, but also shadows moving against the glow. These shadows looked like they were carrying something heavy. He thought about stopping and helping, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the strange time of day, or maybe it was the way those shapes moved with such urgency. He kept going, but the picture stayed in his mind and came back to him every night before bed. The Holloways had a German shepherd named Duke who used to run around the property. He was a gentle but protective dog who barked excitedly when visitors came over. Duke just vanished in the middle of April. Thomas told the few people who asked that the animal had run away, probably after a rabbit or fox. But that didn't make sense to anyone who knew Duke. He was too loyal and well-trained to just leave the area he had been guarding for years. Some people thought that maybe he had found something he shouldn't have, or that he had dug where he wasn't supposed to. Even though Margaret didn't have any family members buried there, she started going to the local cemetery. As she walked among the old tombstones, she touched the stones that had been worn down by time, as if she were looking for comfort or a way to connect with those who had already died. From a distance, the cemetery caretaker, an old man who had been in charge of the place for decades, watched. He had seen a lot of people who were sad over the years, so he knew what to look for in people who had just lost someone. Everyone thought that no one in the Holloway family had died, but Margaret showed all of them. People started to talk about the farm in a quiet way. There was nothing clear or provable, but people had a feeling when they heard the name Holloway. It was like an invisible curtain had come down over that property, cutting it off from the rest of the neighborhood. The few people who still talked to the couple saw changes in how they interacted with each other. Thomas and Margaret hardly talked to each other. They only communicated with quick gestures and glances that only they understood. It was the kind of quiet that comes from keeping secrets and making choices that can't be changed. A traveling salesman who sold farming tools had a strange time at Holloway Farm. Thomas stood at the entrance to the property and blocked any view of the inside. The talk was short and tense, and Thomas wouldn't even look at the product catalog. But what really caught the salesman's attention was the smell. There was a strong chemical smell coming from somewhere in the back, along with something earthy and sweet that he couldn't put his finger on. When Thomas asked about it, he said he was taking care of pests in the barn and then hung up. Margaret's letters to a cousin in Ohio, who lived far away, stopped coming. The cousin was worried after not hearing from them for weeks, so they tried calling the farm, but the line was always busy or no one answered. She thought about going to see her, but she couldn't because of the distance and her own duties. Later, when she finally got to talk to Margaret, the conversation was oddly shallow, with short answers and a clear desire to hang up. The cousin thought she was talking to a different version of the woman she had known, as if something deep inside her had changed. Summer was coming, which meant longer days and heat that made the air shake over the fields. That forbidden piece of land stayed the same, but now there was something new. Wildflowers started to grow there in a way that was much more colorful than anywhere else on the property. It was a beautiful but disturbing sight, as if something was feeding the earth in a way that wasn't natural. Thomas didn't touch the flowers. He wouldn't let anyone get close to them. They grew freely, swaying in the wind, and their roots protected whatever made the soil so fertile. Summer came in full force, bringing the typical humid heat of Michigan that made people sweat before noon. The fields around Holloway Farm were golden and rolling in the bright sun, but that one strip of land stayed a lush green mystery, unlike anything else in the area. There were two worlds on the same property, with only old fences and Thomas's watchful eye keeping them apart. Margaret started going to the city library a lot, which she had never done before. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman who knew how all the patrons liked to read, saw that Margaret's choices were strange. She read books about geology, soil composition, and how different elements affect how plants grow. These were not normal readings for a woman who had spent her whole life farming in a traditional way. She flipped through the books quickly, as if she needed to find answers to questions she couldn't ask out loud. Thomas started hiring temporary workers more often, but none of them stayed for very long. Some people said the work was too hard, while others said there was something about it that made them feel uneasy. In the town bar, a young man said that there were parts of the farm where Thomas wouldn't let anyone walk, and that he got angry when someone got too close to those invisible lines. The young man didn't come back for the second day of work. Instead, he decided to look for work on properties that were farther away, even if it meant a longer trip. The heavy rains from summer storms turned the dirt paths into mud pits. A huge branch fell on the fence that protected that strange area during one of these very bad storms. When the storm finally stopped at dawn, Thomas was there, fixing the damage at a breakneck pace. He worked hard in the hot sun, sweating and breathing heavily, but he was determined to fix that barrier before anyone could get close. Margaret watched him from the balcony of the house. She was as still as a statue and had a look of fear and acceptance on her face. The pastor of the local church, a kind man who really cared about his flock, chose to visit Holloway Farm. He had seen how Margaret's health was getting worse, how she seemed to get weaker every Sunday. When Thomas got to the property, he greeted him with stiff politeness but made it clear that this was not a good time. The priest gently pushed back, saying he was worried about Margaret and just wanted to talk for a few minutes. Thomas agreed, but the talk happened on the porch, where he was always in a position to block any view of the inside of the house. Margaret came by for a short time, looking pale and quiet. She told the priest that everything was fine, and that she was just tired from the summer. But her eyes told a different story, one of sleepless nights and a heavy heart. The animals on the farm started acting strangely. The cows wouldn't graze near that area. They always kept a respectful distance, as if their instincts told them something was wrong. When the horses were led along paths that were too close, they neighed nervously. To make room for these changes, Thomas had to change the whole grazing schedule, which made the routes longer and less efficient. He never said anything about it. He just changed the way he did things without explaining why. One afternoon, a group of women from the church surprised them with a visit. They brought homemade jams and cakes, which they always did when someone in the community needed help. Margaret opened the door and thanked them for the gifts, but she didn't let them in. It was clear that they were not welcome past the door. The women left feeling confused and a little hurt. They talked to each other about how the Holloways had changed and how they seemed to have put up invisible walls around themselves. After that, no one tried to visit again. The sounds were different on warm summer nights. There were no more flashes of light, just the sounds of shovels digging in the ground, something heavy being dragged, and muffled voices arguing. The closest neighbors, whose homes were a few kilometers away, sometimes heard these echoes carried by the night wind. But it was too easy to think that everything was just a figment of their imagination, or the wind playing tricks on the empty fields. It was easier to believe that than to think about the fact that something really bad might be going on that lonely farm. Margaret started to lose weight in a way that was easy to see. Her clothes got baggy, and her face got sharper. She looked like she was eating herself from the inside out, as if some fire inside her was burning her up. Thomas's body also changed, but in a different way. He got harder and more angular, as if he were slowly turning to stone. His muscles were tight, his jaw was always clenched, and his eyes never really rested. It was the body of someone who was carrying a load that got heavier every day. At the end of summer, there was an unexpected drought. The fields turned yellow, and the streams got dangerously low. But that strange place stayed green and alive, as if it had a secret water source. The flowers kept blooming with an unnatural intensity, and their bright colors stood out sharply against the dry landscape around them. It was beautiful and wrong at the same time, a living contradiction that made anyone who saw it feel a shiver run down their spine, even in the heat of those long days. The heat of summer was gone, and autumn brought a new mood to Holloway Farm. The leaves started to turn gold and red as they slowly fell across the fields that were now resting after the harvest. Thomas had a good enough crop to keep the property running for another year, but the way he moved was mechanical, like he was just going through the motions without really feeling connected to the land he worked. Margaret didn't go to town at all anymore. Thomas always did the shopping now. He would go to the grocery store with lists written in shaky handwriting that weren't his. Helen, the owner, kept these lists in a drawer, but she wasn't sure why. It could have been just curiosity, or it could have been something deeper. A need to keep proof of something she couldn't name. The lists were always practical, objective, but occasionally there were strange items mixed in with the flour and sugar. Cleaning products in unusual quantities, excess candles, things that made Helen frown even as she packed them. A science teacher from the local school, a curious man by nature, was intrigued by reports about that area of the farm that flourished so differently. He tried to talk to Thomas about it during a chance meeting in town, mentioning that it would be interesting to study that soil to understand what combination of factors created such fertility. Thomas cut him off abruptly, saying there was nothing special, that it was just good soil and hard work. But the way his shoulders tensed, how his hands clenched into involuntary fists, said otherwise. The teacher didn't insist, but the interaction remained in his mind like an unsolved puzzle. Margaret's letters to her cousin in Ohio started arriving again, but they were different. Too short, devoid of any real emotion. Sentences about the weather, about minor repairs around the house, about nothing that really mattered. The cousin kept these letters along with the old ones, and the difference was striking. It was like comparing the handwriting of two different people, even though the writing was technically the same. One had life, warmth, personality. The other was just ink on paper, words formed out of obligation, not out of a desire for genuine communication. The old barn, which hadn't been used in years, started to show signs of recent activity. The door, once hanging crooked on rusty hinges, had been repaired. New boards replaced rotten ones in parts of the structure. Thomas had clearly dedicated time and effort to making that space functional again, but to what end? No one saw anything being stored there. No new equipment, no crops being kept. The barn simply remained closed, its windows covered from the inside with something that completely blocked the light. It was a structure that now had a purpose, but a purpose that was meant to remain hidden. Autumn storms brought strong winds that made the trees dance violently. On one of these windy nights, a neighbor saw something on the main road that made him stop his car. The old barn had light coming from it, but it wasn't steady like a lamp. It flickered like candle flames, and there were a lot of shadows moving against that dim light. He stood there for a few minutes thinking about whether or not to go inside and check on things, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the shiver that went down his spine, or the thought that some things are better left alone. He kept driving, but he looked in the rearview mirror a few times and saw those flashing lights until they disappeared into the distance. Margaret started to show up at the upstairs window of the house every evening, always still. She would stand there for hours, staring at that part of the property that she wasn't supposed to, as if she were watching something or just couldn't look away. Some people who walked by saw her shadow against the dim light inside, which made her look like a ghost. It was scary to see someone so still, so deep in thought about something that other people couldn't see. When Thomas saw her, he would gently pull her away from the window and close the curtains tightly. The pastor of the church tried again to get in touch with the Holloways, this time by inviting them to a community dinner in the parish hall. It was a tradition in the fall for the community to get together before the cold, lonely months. Thomas politely said no, saying he was too busy with his farm work, but the pastor kept pushing, saying it would be good for Margaret to get out and meet new people. Then Thomas changed his mind and said that maybe next year would be better for Margaret because she wasn't feeling well. The pastor left that conversation with a heavy heart, feeling like he had failed in some way and should have done more, but not knowing what. Crows started to gather around that strange place. Dozens of them sat in the trees nearby and watched with their small, smart eyes. They didn't land right on that forbidden ground, but they kept a close eye on it. Thomas scared them off by throwing rocks and making noise, but they always came back. It was like some instinct pulled them there, something that only animals that are closer to nature could see. People in the area believed that crows were bad signs that something was wrong. Thomas acted like he didn't believe in these superstitions, but every time he looked at the group of black birds, he looked uncomfortable. As fall went on, the air started to change. There was an early chill, a dampness that got into the bones. And with it came a smell that was faint at first, almost impossible to notice, but that got stronger over time. It smelled like dirt, like things that should be buried staying buried. When the wind blew in the right direction, the neighbors could sometimes smell it, but it was easy to blame on natural causes, like leaves that were rotting, or maybe a dead animal in the woods. No one thought about it too much because that would mean hearing answers that no one wanted to hear. That year, winter came earlier than expected. It brought a layer of snow that covered everything in a quiet white blanket. Holloway Farm became even more cut off from the outside world, surrounded by a beautiful landscape that made it look like the sky and earth were one. It was the kind of quiet that made every sound and movement louder, so no one could miss it. Thomas went out even less. The grocery store started taking phone orders and delivering them right to the front door. The young delivery man said that Thomas always waited on the main road and never let him go up to the house. He did this work to help pay for things. He quickly picked up the boxes, paid in full cash, and ignored any attempts to talk. The young man said that Thomas's eyes showed something, a deep tiredness that went beyond just being physically tired. It was like looking at someone who hadn't slept in weeks and had too many heavy thoughts to share. People stopped seeing Margaret. She wasn't at the window, on the porch, or anywhere else. It was like she had turned into a ghost in her own house, a presence that everyone knew was there, but no one could prove any more. The women at church were worried and quietly talked about illnesses, too much time alone, and how winter affected some people in strange ways, but no one took the initiative to check or make a visit. The Holloways had made it very clear that they didn't want company, and the winter in Michigan was too harsh for travel that wasn't necessary. There was something strange that happened in that part of the farm that was covered in snow. Patterns appeared where everything should have been the same shade of white. In some places, the snow melted faster, leaving behind strange patterns that didn't make sense. It felt like the ground was giving off heat, or like something was breaking down there and making enough energy to melt the ice. Of course, no one got close enough to look into it, but those patterns could be seen from a distance, especially at dawn when the low light made them stand out more. The town doctor, who had known most of the families in the area for decades, was confused by the fact that Margaret was nowhere to be found. In the winter, there were usually flu outbreaks, small accidents, and other reasons for people to see a doctor, but the Holloways never showed up or asked for home visits. He casually told a few people about it, showing concern as a professional, but also saying that there wasn't much he could do if the family didn't ask for help. Even when privacy started to seem suspicious, people still had a right to it. The long nights of winter brought strange sounds that echoed through the cold, clear air. Some neighbors said they heard what sounded like people talking loud voices coming from the Holloway farm. Not quite fights, but very heated talks. The kind of talks that are so emotional that they can cross walls and distances. But when you listened more closely, you could tell it was always one voice, Thomas talking to himself, or maybe not quite alone, maybe answering someone who didn't want to talk. It was scary to think about those one-sided talks happening in the dark of that empty house. The old barn was still a busy place at night. There were faint lights that sometimes shone through cracks in the boards, and shadows moved around inside often enough to show that Thomas spent a lot of time there. What he did there, alone in the cold of winter, made people wonder. Some people thought he was building something, while others thought he might be storing food or protecting valuable tools. But there were also darker theories that were whispered so quietly that the icy wind almost drowned them out. The trees around the property started to show strange signs. There were dead branches where there shouldn't have been any, and the bark was peeling as if something had scratched or gnawed at it. The crows that used to gather there now stayed even farther away, sitting in trees that were farther away but never stopping watching. It was like even the wild animals knew that something had changed in that area, that an invisible line had been crossed. Just like Margaret had done months before, Thomas started going to the cemetery a lot. He always went at dusk, when the sun was going down, but it wasn't completely dark yet. He would stand there with his hands in his pockets, breathing out clouds in the cold air, among the tombstones covered in snow. The caretaker looked out from the little house at the entrance to the cemetery and wondered why that man came there so often. Thomas didn't go to any one grave, he just walked among them, as if he were weighing his options, or looking for comfort in the quiet company of the dead. Even more lime was delivered during the winter than before. The supplier was curious and wanted to know why there was so much lime when nothing could be planted. Thomas gave a vague answer about getting ready for spring and treating the soil to keep it healthy. The answer made sense from a technical point of view, but Thomas's nervous behavior and the way he quickly unloaded the bags made me feel uneasy. The supplier left with the feeling that something was wrong, but they couldn't say what it was. On a very cold morning in January, Margaret came back for a short time. She was outside on the porch, barefoot in the snow, and only wearing a thin dressing gown. She stood there for a few minutes before Thomas rushed out of the house and brought her back inside with almost violent urgency. A neighbor who was walking by on the road saw the scene from a distance. The sight of that thin, pale woman against the white snow was so ghostly that he doubted what he had seen for a moment. He told his wife when he got home, and she said it might be time for someone to do something. But what and who? As winter continued to rule over the frozen land, the questions went unanswered. In February, snowstorms cut off many rural homes, including Holloway Farm. Roads were closed for days, and even deliveries had to be put on hold. It was the kind of complete isolation that can either make people stronger or break them, depending on what they have inside them. Those weeks without talking to anyone outside of Thomas and Margaret's house seemed to be just what they wanted, or maybe what they needed to do whatever they were doing without anyone watching. The first person to come to the area after the roads were finally cleared was the postman, who finished his delayed route. He saw something strange in the mailbox of the Holloways. There were letters he had left weeks before that were still there, along with bills and mail that no one had picked up. It was strange, especially since Thomas had always been very careful with his payments and paperwork. The postman thought about going up to the house to see if everything was okay, but something stopped him. Maybe it was because the property looked so quiet and closed off. He picked up the old letters, left the new ones, and kept going, feeling uneasy for no reason. After months of not hearing from Margaret's cousin in Ohio, she finally decided to do something she had been putting off. She called the county sheriff and said she was worried about Margaret's health and asked someone to check on her. The sheriff, who was practical and knew a lot about how rural families worked, said he would come by when the snow stopped. But weeks went by, other problems came up, and that visit kept getting put off. There was no official complaint, no proof of a crime, just a worried relative who lived far away. It was something that could wait on the list of things to do. In March, Thomas came back to town. He was thinner and grayer than anyone remembered. He looked like he had aged 10 years in just a few months. His shoulders were curved in a way that they hadn't been before, and there were deep wrinkles around his eyes. He bought basic things, paid bills that were past due without saying anything, and didn't respond to attempts to talk to him. Helen tried to find out how Margaret was doing and if they needed help. Thomas just nodded that everything was fine and left quickly. The space where he had been seemed to fill with a heavy silence. The snow started to melt, and the ground underneath it showed all of its complexity. And that part of the farm, that piece of land that had been the subject of so much speculation, looked very different. The garden, which had once been full of life, now looked like it had been dug up and buried again and again. There were hills and valleys in the land, so it wasn't flat. Thomas had put up new fences that were higher and stronger, which made it even harder to see what was there. It was a lot of work for one person, especially in the cold of late winter. The pastor finally got someone to come over. One morning in March, he just showed up at the farm, determined to see Margaret for himself. Thomas answered the door with a stern look, but the pastor stood his ground and said it was his job as a pastor to make sure that all of his congregation members were okay. Thomas finally let him in after a long time of thinking about it. The house was surprisingly clean, but it felt like it was just a place to sleep and not a home. Margaret came down the stairs slowly, holding on to the handrail like she needed help. She was unrecognizable, too thin, too pale, and her eyes were so sunken that they looked like they could see through things. She talked to the pastor for a few minutes in a polite way, telling him she was fine, just tired. But her hands shook all the time, and she couldn't keep eye contact for more than a few seconds. The pastor was very upset after that visit. He thought about telling the police about his worries, but what would he say? That a woman was thin and shaking? That a couple looked like they were having problems? There was nothing solid that would have made the government step in. It was just a gut feeling that something was very wrong. He decided to stay in touch and visit them often, but deep down he knew that Thomas wouldn't let him visit again. That was a one-time concession that came about because of surprise and maybe the need to keep up appearances. And the animals on the farm looked like they weren't being taken care of. The cows were thinner, and the horses looked nervous and like they weren't being cared for well. It wasn't total neglect, but it was clear that Thomas wasn't paying them enough attention. He was thinking about something else that took all of his energy and attention. The neighbors saw this from a distance and talked among themselves about whether or not they should help. However, the Holloways had built an invisible wall around themselves that was hard to get through. Everyone knew that there was a rural pride that made it hard for people to ask for help. As spring got closer, the nights got longer, and with them came the weird sounds. Not the sounds of construction or moving dirt anymore, but something else. Sounds that sounded like the moans of the wind, but came from places where there shouldn't be any wind. Echoes that sounded like voices, but were too distorted to make out words. Some of the more superstitious neighbors started to say that Holloway Farm was cursed, and that the Holloways had done something to wake up forces that should not be disturbed. Of course, these were just stories, the kind of thing people say when they can't explain something. But the stories kept going, getting longer and more detailed with each telling. Margaret wrote her cousin one last letter. It was short and written in shaky handwriting that didn't look like hers at all. It just said that she loved her cousin, that she remembered the summers they spent together when they were kids with fondness, and that she hoped people would remember her kindly. It ended with a strange request, that her cousin not come to see her no matter what happened, because some things were better left alone. The cousin got this letter and felt a chill of foreboding. She put it in a drawer with all the other letters, not knowing that it would be the last time she heard from Margaret Holloway. Spring came back with a bang, bringing with it the full thaw and the promise of a new beginning that the season always brings. At Holloway Farm, though, spring seemed to have a different, darker meaning. It felt like it was the end of something that had been building for months, not the start of something new. The fields around the house started to get their color back, with the soft green of new grass growing through the still damp ground of the end of winter. The birds came back and sang their morning songs, which were full of life-affirming melodies. But those crows, who were quiet and watched, stayed on their constant watch, sitting in the trees around the property like black sentinels marking off limits. Thomas started getting ready for the new harvest, but he didn't have the energy and drive that he usually has at this time of year. He walked through the fields like a robot, doing the things he needed to do without showing any signs of being emotionally connected to the work. People who lived near him and saw him from a distance sometimes talked about how he had changed, even how he stood. He was not bent by the weight of age, but by the weight of something he couldn't see that he carried on his shoulders. His hands, which were always steady when he was holding tools and guiding the plow, shook a lot now, as if they had touched things they shouldn't have. People were saying things about Margaret that weren't true. No one saw her or heard her speak, and Thomas answered any questions about her with short, curt words and a closed expression that made people not want to look into it any further. It was like she had disappeared into the shadows of that house, becoming a presence that could be felt but never seen. The church women, who had been talking about their worries in hushed tones, now spoke more openly about them. They organized another visit, this time with the pastor accompanying them, determined to personally check on Margaret's well-being. But when they arrived at the farm, they found the gates locked and a crudely scribbled notice saying they were not receiving visitors due to contagious disease. It was obviously an excuse, but it worked. No one wanted to risk exposure to something unknown, especially with so many stories still fresh in their minds about past epidemics. That mysterious area of the farm was undergoing dramatic transformations with the arrival of spring. The flowers that had grown so exuberantly the previous year returned, but this time there was something different about them. Their colors were too intense, almost artificial in their vibrancy, as if they had been painted instead of growing naturally. And the growth pattern was strange, concentrated in specific areas, as if marking precise points in the soil. Thomas spent days working in that section, digging, replanting, rearranging the earth with an urgency bordering on desperation. He worked from before dawn until after nightfall, illuminated by lanterns that created dancing and grotesque shadows against the nearby fences and trees. The town doctor, still concerned about Margaret's prolonged absence, tried a different approach. He wrote a letter to Thomas, offering to make a free home visit, mentioning that he understood how difficult it could be for sick people to travel to town. It was a genuine offer of help, written with care and compassion. The reply arrived 2 weeks later, brief and cold. Thomas thanked him for his concern and told him that everything was fine. He said that Margaret was slowly getting better and wanted to be alone during this time. The doctor kept both the letter he sent and the response he got. He put them in a file with his notes on the Holloway family. He always wrote down strange cases, and there was definitely something strange going on that remote farm. The temporary workers Thomas was trying to hire to help with the spring planting only stayed for 1 day. There were consistent reports of the oppressive atmosphere of the place, how even the air seemed heavier on that property. One boy described feeling constantly nauseous while working there, a sense of unease that disappeared as soon as he left the farm's boundaries. Another mentioned strange sounds coming from the old barn, noises he couldn't identify but that made him feel deeply uncomfortable. A third simply said there was something wrong with the land in that fenced area, that it seemed alive in an unnatural way, that he could feel something pulsing underneath when he stepped too close. These were descriptions that could easily be dismissed as imagination or superstition, but they came from different people who didn't know each other, all reporting similar experiences. Helen at the grocery store noticed a change in Thomas's shopping habits. He had started buying a lot of cleaning supplies, especially ones that were good at killing germs. He also bought a lot of candles, whole boxes of them, as well as matches and kerosene. When she casually commented on the quantity, suggesting she might get a discount for large orders, Thomas merely mumbled something incomprehensible and paid quickly. His clothes, which used to always be clean even after a long day of work on the farm, now had stains that wouldn't come out no matter how many times he washed them. There was dirt under his fingernails that looked like it had become part of him, like he had been digging with his bare hands for hours. The sheriff finally made his promised visit, spurred both by the call from Margaret's cousin and the growing rumors circulating in town. He arrived on a clear April afternoon, the sun shining and the verdant fields creating a seemingly idyllic scene. Thomas greeted him with tense politeness, answering all questions superficially, adequately. Yes, Margaret was home. Yes, she was getting better. No, there was nothing wrong. No, you couldn't talk to her right then because she was sleeping. The sheriff, who was good at reading people, knew that something was being hidden, but he couldn't do anything about it because he didn't have a warrant, a formal complaint, or proof of a crime. He left, making mental notes and deciding to keep an eye on that property. He might even drop by without warning in the future. But the future has ways of getting around our plans. The storms in the spring brought heavy rains that turned the trails into rivers of mud. One of these storms was so bad that lightning lit up the sky so often that it was blinding. It was during one of these flashes that a neighbor saw something that would haunt him for years. For a split second, the lightning lit up the second-story window, and he thought he saw Margaret there. The figure was too thin and pale, and in the white light of the lightning, it looked almost see-through. She had her hands on the glass and her mouth open as if she were screaming, but the storm was too loud for anyone to hear her. Then it got dark again. When the next lightning bolt lit up the sky a few seconds later, the window was empty. The neighbor stood in the rain for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. In the end, he convinced himself that it was just a trick of the light, a mirage made by the lightning and wet glass. Thomas started going to the local bar a lot, which he had never done before. He would sit alone in a corner and drink without talking to anyone. But sometimes, when he had too much to drink, he would mumble things to himself that didn't make sense. Something about choices that have to be made, about burdens that have to be carried, and about how sometimes there are no good choices. The bar owner, who was used to hearing drunks confess, listened, but could never put the pieces together into a story that made sense. It was like hearing half of a conversation, the part that answered questions that hadn't been asked yet. The ground in that area that was off limits started to sink in some places, making shallow holes that filled with water after it rained. Thomas worked like crazy to fix these holes by bringing in new soil, compacting it and leveling it, but they kept coming back, as if something underneath was settling and shifting, making holes that the surface had to fill. The crows watched him closely, tilting their heads in strange ways as if they knew what was going on in a way that people didn't. The way they watched was unsettlingly smart, and their patience made it seem like they knew they would eventually get to whatever was being so carefully guarded. May came, bringing the soft warmth that makes the earth breathe and everything come back to life. But Holloway Farm seemed to be in a different season, in a parallel world where spring couldn't fully get in. There was a sense of purpose in the air, as if something that had been building for months was finally coming to an end. Thomas gave up on pretending to do normal farm work. The fields were still partly unplanted, the cattle were free to roam without proper supervision, and all he could think about was that stupid fenced-in area that had become the center of his life. On a night with no moon, someone slipped an anonymous letter under the church door. The writing was shaky and hard to read, but the message was clear. It told someone to go to the Holloway farm and check on it because something bad was going on there and Margaret needed help. There was no signature or other sign of who had written it. The pastor gave the letter to the sheriff, who read it with a serious look on his face. Of course, it could be a hoax, but it could also be a real cry for help from someone who is too scared to show their face. This time, they decided to make an official visit together without telling anyone ahead of time. They used the power that the anonymous letter gave them as an excuse. They got to the farm on a foggy morning when the dew was still on everything, making it look silver. The gate was open, which was strange because it seemed like Thomas had stopped taking care of the barriers. They drove down the dirt road to the house and saw that buildings that used to be well kept were now falling apart. The porch had loose boards, the windows were too dirty to see through, and there was a smell in the air that neither of them could quite identify. Something chemical mixed with damp earth, and a hint of something sweet and unpleasant that made their stomachs churn. Thomas left the house before they could knock on the door. He looked like a different person than the one they both knew. He was older, more hunched over, and his eyes had a glassy quality that made it look like he hadn't slept in days and was thinking about things that drove him crazy. He didn't look surprised to see them, as if he had been expecting them to come, as if he knew that someone would come to ask him questions he couldn't avoid any longer. His voice was hoarse from not using it, and it was clear that he was trying hard to say each word. The sheriff was very clear. People had told them they were worried about Margaret, so they had to go see her to make sure she was okay. Thomas didn't say anything for a long time. He stared at the floor and nervously opened and closed his hands. Then, in a voice that was hard to hear, he said that Margaret had gone. The pastor wanted to know where she was going and when she would be back. Thomas shook his head slowly and said again that she had left and would not be coming back. The answer's vagueness made for a tense silence. The sheriff asked to come in and check for himself. Thomas didn't fight back. He just stepped aside and let them through, looking like someone who had finally reached the end of a long escape. The inside of the house showed how the people who lived there were feeling. There was a sense of emptiness that went beyond the lack of decoration, even though things were in order. It was like life had been sucked out of that room, leaving only the walls and furniture. The room that clearly belonged to Margaret was untouched. The bed was made with military precision, clothes were still hanging in the closet, and personal items were neatly arranged on the dressing table. Depending on how you look at it, it could be a sanctuary or a tomb. The pastor lightly touched a hairbrush that still had blonde strands stuck in its bristles and felt a shiver run down his back. They asked a lot of questions. Where was Margaret at that time? What time did she leave? Where had she gone? Was there a way to get in touch with her? Thomas never lied directly, but he also never gave a full answer. He said she was at peace. She wasn't in pain anymore. She had chosen to leave. The answers were only partially true and hid bigger truths that everyone in the room knew. The sheriff took a tougher approach and threatened to start a formal investigation that could lead to legal action. Thomas just stared at him with blank eyes and asked what he was being accused of doing. And that was the main problem. There was no body, no proof of a crime, and no one who saw it happen. There was only worry, absence, and strange behavior. None of that gave them a legal reason to take more aggressive action. The sheriff and Thomas both knew this, and the knowledge made the air in that room almost unbearable. The pastor tried a different way to get through to Thomas. He talked about redemption and the peace that comes from confessing heavy burdens. Thomas listened quietly, and tears finally streamed down his tired face, but he didn't say anything that could be taken as an admission of guilt. They wanted to see the property, especially the part that Thomas was so protective of. He thought about it for a second and looked like he was going to say no, but then he sighed deeply and said yes. He took them through the fields to the fenced-in area and opened the gate with shaking hands. What they saw there made them feel very uneasy. It was just land with jagged mounds covered in flowers that were very bright. But there was something very unsettling about that place. It felt like they were looking at something that should stay hidden, and that the surface beauty hid truths that the human mind wasn't ready to deal with. The sheriff walked slowly around the area, looking and judging. He saw the holes Thomas had tried to fill, the uneven pattern of the soil, and the fact that some areas looked like they had been disturbed more recently than others. He got down on one knee, picked up some dirt, and let it fall through his fingers. It was dark and rich, and the texture was strange in a way he couldn't quite put into words. There was something strange about that dirt that made his investigator's instincts go off like alarms. He let the earth fall back to the ground and wiped his hands on his pants in a way that showed he was very worried. The pastor prayed there without being asked. His words flowed softly, like a prayer for lost souls, for hidden truths, and for a peace that seemed impossible in that place full of silence. Thomas kept his head down during the prayer, and his shoulders shook with silent tears. After the pastor was done, Thomas said something about how he had done his best, how love can take forms that other people can't understand, and how some burdens must be carried in silence until the end. They were strange words that hinted at a lot but didn't prove anything. The sheriff felt like he was up against something he couldn't prove, but knew in his heart was true. He wasn't sure if there were real or figurative secrets buried in that land. But Margaret's absence, Thomas's behavior, and that area that was so closely guarded all fit into a pattern that his experience recognized, even without proof. He told Thomas that it wasn't over and that he would keep looking into it until the truth came out. Thomas just nodded, as if he had already accepted this fate. They left the farm with more questions than answers, and both of them felt uneasy that they couldn't shake off. The sheriff said he would keep looking, talk to Margaret's cousin, look for records, and not let this go unpunished. But they both knew that there wasn't much that could be done officially without hard proof, without knowing what really happened to Margaret. Thomas stood alone on the porch, watching them leave. The sky was getting darker as another spring storm approached. In the days that followed, the sheriff worked non-stop, making calls, talking to other counties, and looking for any clues that might help him find Margaret. He called hospitals, looked at travel records, and talked to relatives who lived far away, but he still couldn't find anything. Margaret Holloway had just disappeared, leaving behind only memories of her and the feeling of emptiness that hung over the farm like a thick fog. Thomas kept doing his daily tasks alone, working the land that held its secrets, and living with the burden of choices that only he knew were right. And the community, without clear answers, slowly came to terms with the fact that some stories don't have clear endings, and that some mysteries will always be hidden, no matter how much light you try to shine on them. People felt uneasy passing by Holloway Farm, which became a marked place on the map. The air was thick with the feeling that something terrible had happened there, like an invisible perfume that never fully went away. The mood in the small rural community changed noticeably in the days after that visit. People began to speak more openly about the Holloway farm, about the strange months they had witnessed, about the small pieces of a puzzle that no one really wanted to assemble because the final picture promised to be too disturbing. The sheriff spent hours in his office going through old papers, looking for something, anything, that could make his suspicions legal. But the papers only confirmed what everyone already knew. Thomas and Margaret Holloway were the rightful owners of that land. They were law-abiding citizens with no criminal record, and they had been good, if quiet, members of the community until recently. When Margaret's cousin in Ohio got the sheriff's call, she felt both relieved and scared. She was relieved that someone was finally listening to her worries, but scared because knowing something was wrong was somehow worse than not knowing. She told him everything she knew: the letters that had stopped coming, the last strange message telling her not to visit, and the years of regular communication that had just stopped. The sheriff wrote down everything carefully and promised to keep her updated. However, both of them ended the conversation knowing that was all he could give her without anything more solid to back up a full official investigation. Thomas began appearing in town more frequently, but in a different way now. He no longer avoided people, no longer shied away from conversations. Instead, he seemed to be seeking some kind of human connection he had lost during the months of isolation. He would sit on the bench in front of the grocery store and watch people go by. Sometimes he would start small talk about the weather, the crops, or nothing that really mattered. Helen saw that he was trying to remember how to be a normal person and how to fit in with the flow of community life. But these interactions had a performance quality to them, as if he were following a script for how to act without really feeling the feelings that should go with it. The farmhouse started to change in some ways. Thomas started doing repairs that no one expected, like painting the walls that were peeling, fixing the windows that were broken, and cutting the grass that had grown wild around the house. It was like he was trying to make up for months of neglect and bring back some sense of normalcy and care. But that fenced-in area stayed the same. The flowers kept blooming in strange ways, and the ground kept settling in ways that made new, uneven holes that he filled over and over again, only to have them come back weeks later. The pastor couldn't stop thinking about that visit. The flowers were too bright, and the soil seemed to be getting nutrients from something unnatural. He started to quietly look into it by talking to older farmers about farming methods and what kinds of conditions could lead to such rapid growth. The answers he got were logical and technical, but none of them really explained how strong what he had seen was. An old farmer said that well-fertilized soil sometimes grew exceptionally well, but then he looked at the pastor with a strange look, as if he understood something that wasn't being said, and quickly changed the subject. The heat of summer really hit in June. It was the kind of heat that made the air ripple over the fields and turned afternoons into slow, sticky dreams. When you looked at Holloway Farm from the main road, it looked almost normal, even though it had only been superficially changed. But those who got closer, those who had to walk by, said they always felt uneasy. There was something in the air, maybe a smell that changed with the wind, Or maybe it was just the feeling that everyone there knew something was wrong, that the property held secrets that seeped through the fences and made the area around it feel sick. The sheriff went to the farm 2 more times, always with official reasons, but he was really just there to keep an eye on things and look for any mistakes that could lead to more decisive action. Thomas was polite but tired when he met him. He answered questions and let him look around a little. He seemed to have accepted the constant surveillance, or maybe he had grown confident that nothing could be proven. The sheriff asked for permission to bring someone to look at that part of the land on the second visit. It could have been an agricultural expert who could explain the strange properties. Thomas politely but firmly said no, saying that he didn't want strangers looking at his land because he had property rights. And in the eyes of the law, he was right. The sheriff couldn't force it without a warrant or a good reason to believe a specific crime had happened. That year, the summer storms were especially bad. They brought heavy rains that turned the ground to mud and made streams overflow. One of these storms was so bad that it changed everything on the farm. The rain was so heavy that the ground couldn't soak up all of the water. Torrents started to form, rushing across the fields, carving out channels, moving soil, and changing the landscape that Thomas had worked so hard to keep up. When Thomas went outside the next morning to see how bad the damage was, he fell to his knees in the mud. He worked all day, bringing in new soil, replanting, and trying to fix the protective covering that the storm had partially taken away. But people who lived nearby and drove by that morning saw him working hard and were curious about what could make him so urgent. One of them told the sheriff in passing that Thomas looked scared and that things were different on the farm after the storm. The sheriff, who always paid attention to changes in behavior, decided to visit again without telling anyone. This time, he brought a deputy with him. They got there in the afternoon, when the sun was already low in the sky and the fields were full of long shadows. When they got there, Thomas wasn't home. They found him in the fenced-off area, kneeling in the mud with dirty hands as he tried to fix a part that had been especially damaged by the storm. He was so focused on his urgent work that he didn't hear them coming. The deputy was the first to notice that something was off in that area. The rain had uncovered patterns in the soil that didn't make sense for regular farmland. The sheriff called Thomas, and his voice had an authority that made it clear there would be no discussion. Thomas turned slowly, his face showing that he had given up. He didn't try to explain, and he didn't make any excuses or justifications. He just stood there, covered in mud, while the sheriff and deputy looked around with more and more worry. There was something very wrong with that place, a feeling that went beyond what I could see and straight to my gut. It was like that primal alarm that goes off when we realize something bad has happened, even if we don't fully understand what it is. The deputy was sent back to town to get more help and to call the police, who would have the tools and authority to do a full investigation. The sheriff stayed with Thomas not so much to keep an eye on him, but because he didn't know what else to do while they were waiting for something to happen that would change that community forever. They were quiet as they sat on the porch of the house. Thomas smoked one cigarette after another, and his hands finally stopped shaking. The sheriff looked at the fields, which looked so peaceful in the golden light of dusk. Thomas was the one who finally spoke up. His voice was low and almost boring, like he was reading facts about someone else's life. He talked about Margaret and how she got sick in the winter. At first, it was just a small problem, but it quickly grew into something terrible. He talked about how she wouldn't go to the doctor, how she was afraid of hospitals, and how he had tried to take care of her by himself. He talked about how she had left, how he couldn't accept her leaving, and how love can make reason seem like something else. His story was broken up, moving back and forth in time and repeating some details while leaving others out completely. It was the confession of a tired man who had kept secrets so heavy for so long that he finally felt better letting them go, even though he knew what would happen next. He talked about being lonely and how the farm was too quiet without Margaret. He said he couldn't just let her go forever, and that he had made choices in moments of despair that seemed to make sense at the time, but were really just what they were when he looked at them in the harsh light of reality. The sheriff didn't say anything while Thomas spoke. He made mental notes of not only the words, but also the pauses, the times when Thomas had trouble continuing, and the tears that silently streamed down his tired face. There was something deeply sad about the situation, as if everyone involved was somehow a victim of events that had built up until they became too much to bear. When Thomas was done talking, the sun had already set, and they were left in the dark except for the dim lights of the house and the distant twinkle of stars that didn't care. The official cars finally showed up, breaking the quiet of the countryside with their city-like urgency. At the entrance to the property, people with tools, experts in different fields, and the full machinery of a serious investigation were getting ready. They took Thomas away, not violently, but firmly, leaving behind the farm that had been his whole life. He didn't fight back or complain. He just looked back one last time at the place where amazing flowers would keep growing for a few more weeks before experts came to look at, document, and finally reveal what had been hidden for so long. And, in that gaze, there wasn't exactly remorse, but something more complex. A mixture of relief and lament that spoke of journeys that couldn't be undone, and choices that once made permanently altered the course of all the lives involved. Night fell completely over Holloway Farm, enveloping it in a darkness that seemed deeper than anywhere else, as if even the starlight hesitated to touch that soil marked by secrets that had finally, inevitably, found their way to the surface. The days that followed brought an eerie stillness to the region, as if the whole land were holding its breath. The windows of Holloway Farm looked out over the fields like dead eyes. Thomas's renovations were still not done. The paint was only half done, and the repairs were stopped halfway through. It was a place that had been frozen in time, marking the moment when everything changed and long-buried secrets came to light. The pastor went to see Thomas once in a place where people talked through bars and were always being watched. It wasn't a religious confession, it was just two men talking about how to make sense of the mess that had happened. Thomas talked about love in ways that the pastor had never thought of before. He said that sometimes caring for someone means doing things that the world would never understand, and that when you're alone for too long, the line between devotion and obsession can become blurry. The pastor didn't get any clear answers from that meeting. Instead, he left with more questions about what it means to be human and the dark places where even the best intentions can take us. People in the community reacted in different ways. Some thought they had failed in some way and should have seen it coming sooner and acted more quickly. Some people just wanted to forget about it, move on, and leave that dark time behind. People stopped talking about Holloway Farm as much, and instead talked about more important things, like the comforting routine of harvests and seasons, births and weddings life going on because that's what life did, even when there were shadows that crossed it. Finally, Margaret's cousin went on the trip she had been putting off for so long. She stood on the road in front of the property and looked at the house where her cousin had lived for so long. She didn't need to go in. She stood there, thinking about summers long ago when they were kids, and the world seemed easier and the future looked bright. She tied wildflowers to the fence at the entrance as a quiet tribute to memories that were now permanently stained by knowledge she didn't want to have. They dug up all of the ground where the flowers grew in such a strange way. The earth was taken away and looked at. Then they put new soil in it, clean dirt from other places. But anyone who walked by swore that even so, that piece of land had a quality that stayed there no matter what they did to get rid of it. Maybe it was just imagination, or maybe knowing what had happened changed how they saw things, or maybe some places just have marks that can't be completely erased. Summer moved forward at its own pace. bringing heat that made mirages dance on the asphalt. The fields around the empty farm grew wild again, and nature quickly took back what had been briefly tamed. The crows stopped coming there, as if their job was done, and moved on to other places. People started to stay away from the property, taking longer routes even when it meant longer trips. It wasn't exactly fear, but a discomfort that was easier to avoid than to deal with. Thomas stayed where he was, surrounded by walls that weren't his, living the same days over and over again. He didn't get many visitors, just the occasional pastor, and he didn't talk much. When someone tried to talk to him, his eyes looked far away, as if part of him was still on that farm, walking through fields under the open Michigan sky, carrying burdens that only he knew fully. The weight of those burdens had permanently changed him, making him a shadow of the man he used to be. The land would eventually be sold, and the acres would be given to neighboring farmers who needed more land. The house would be torn down, and its boards and bricks would be strewn about. This would get rid of the physical structure, but not the memories it held. Some people said it was better that way, that some places needed to be erased so that healing could start. Some people thought that erasing was just another way of forgetting, and that forgetting meant not learning anything from what had happened. As it always did, autumn would come again, painting the trees with bright colors and getting the ground ready for winter's rest. And as the seasons changed over and over again, the story of Holloway Farm would slowly become a local legend, told in whispers to make points about being alone, the dangers of keeping secrets too heavy, and how being alone can change even the most ordinary people into versions of themselves they never thought they could become. We walk through this world without ever really knowing what goes on behind the closed doors of the homes we pass, the lives that seem normal on the outside, but have depths we never thought possible. The story of the Holloway family shows us that the line between the normal and the extraordinary is thinner than we like to think. It also shows us that we all have the ability to make choices that would surprise us if the right or wrong circumstances came together. And maybe that's the most upsetting lesson of all, not that monsters exist, but that they can come from places that seemed like any other. People who saw the flowers that grew in that land still remember them. Their unnatural beauty is a perfect metaphor for the whole situation. Beautiful things that come from dark places, life that thrives where it shouldn't, and nature that doesn't care about the human dramas that fertilize its soil. And when the wind blows through those fields, which are now owned by different people, some people still say they hear echoes, not of voices, but of silences that speak louder than words ever could. If you've made it this far on this trip through Michigan's shadows, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know what you thought of the story in the comments. Until the next story takes us back to the mysteries that live in the corners of our memories that we have forgotten.